The smallest ships in the game are M5 scout fighters, and they are hardly better than the spacesuit, really. High cost, not as good speed as you would think, very bad weapons, very bad shielding. I almost never use them. A step up from that are the M4 light fighters or interceptors. This is your starting ship class, and they are the smallest ship that you can really use for combat. They are having quite good weapon mounts, but are very fragile, with low shielding, but very good speed usually, and extremely low cost. So you can also use them as a discount fighter of sorts. The M3 class is the heavy fighter, and that is the most used fighter in the game. And that is also the fighter that I would recommend. It has a good balance of speed, pricing and durability. And especially for the early game, this is the most useful combat ship for the player. Because it's the only one that you can really build in any substantial quantity. But it is a bit fragile, so eventually you also want some heavier ships. Which would be something like this. This is an M6 corvette. And those ships strike like the middle ground between low cost, decent speed, good firepower, actually very good firepower, and some decent durability. Try to build a few of those once you can, because the big benefit of those bigger ships is that you don't lose them as frequently when you are not present in the fight. They can handle their own usually. If you have a group of them, that is some serious firepower. Then we have the M8 bomber class. This is a bit of an oddball because that ship is kind of like a corvette, but it doesn't have the weapons. It's supposed to attack with missiles. It has missile turrets, so it doesn't need to line up and fire those. It can fire the missiles in all directions. But the firepower of missiles in Mayhem is not very high, so usually not too useful. But they have a special ability. They can project sort of an anti-missile shield with the chaff missile and protect the entire fleet against missiles. And they can do that on their own. Usually you need a special equipment, and those guys come with that equipment pre-installed. So they can be good to reduce some of the damage that your fleet is receiving. Once we get to the cap ships, it's getting interesting because everyone wants these. The M7 is the smallest one. The natural downsides of these ships is that they require the larger docking ports, just like the really big guys, even if they are the weakest of the cap ships. And that's a downside. They also have a very large silhouette, they are hit very easily, and they are less maneuverable. So they have problems when they have to line up their weapons with the target to do the maximum damage. But the frigates in Mayhem are still pretty good, usually, because they have a low cost and a high speed, much higher than in the base game. So they can be some of the best response forces that you can set up when you want a fleet to monitor your sectors and then fly there to take some enemy out. Those frigate ships are probably the best for that. But it takes a while to unlock them. They can use the super heavy cap ship weapons. That's also a big benefit that they have. Don't need the really big destroyers. You can also use those weapons on these ships. But there's also a lot of variants. So some of the frigates, I believe this one here, the 𝗦𝗵𝗶𝗽, that's one of the super expensive ones. You have frigates which are hardly more expensive than a corvette. And then you have frigates which are almost like a destroyer, if you consider their pricing. Okay, the 𝗦𝗵𝗶𝗽 is sort of upper end, but not super expensive. But then you also have something like the Thrasher. This is basically almost the price of a heavy destroyer. So a lot of variants, but an interesting ship design in Mayhem. And I like to use the speedy variants for response forces eventually. A subclass of the frigates would be the carriers. So you have frigates which just carry fighters into the battle, like this Griffin here. And you can find them in the ship compendium if you switch the performance page to docking. That shows you the docking ports on these ships. So those just carry fighters, and usually they don't have as much weapon mounts. Then there are missile frigates. Those are designated as M7M. The M stands for missile. And these are basically artillery ships. They require special munitions, which are pretty expensive, but they have extreme range, and the ships themselves are very cheap. But that's sort of a special weapon. You don't really need to use them if you don't want. The M2 class is like the premium combat ship, the destroyers, and they also vary wildly in strength and cost. You have standard designs like this Titan here, and then you have super heavy big battleships which are like 2 Titans in terms of cost and performance, 2 or even 3. And you can easily recognize them if you sort the M2 class in the ship compendium by price. Then you will have half a dozen ships which are just vastly more expensive, and those will be the battleships that the factions are using. And those usually have the highest shield in the game, but the standard destroyer is also pretty good. They are, very expensive, those heavy battleships, and also the standard destroyers. But of course they have staying power. So especially if you are not present and just let them fight on their own, and they have great survivability, and that can save you resources if you don't have to replace losses. And finally we have the M1 class. These are carriers, fleet carriers. Their armament is basically like a weaker version of destroyers. In Mayhem, without a jump drive, they have a bit less utility than in the base game, but they have the ability to repair docked ships, so that's a plus. And you are also not paying maintenance cost for the fighters which are docked here. And usually they can carry a lot. So a carrier with full fighters is usually much stronger than a single destroyer. And the cost would be almost the same or even a bit cheaper, I believe. So that's your premium force multiplier if you want. And the carrier is sort of the home base for the fighters and keeps them combat ready from repairing them, and also reduces their cost. So it has some use. The TS class is your standard freighter. They can carry anything that is not a station kit, basically. There are also different variants, like low-cost versions, like this Mercury here, and better premium freighters like this 𝗬𝘀𝘀𝗀. These are like the primary freight haulers in the game. Then you have the TP class, the P standing for personal. There is not really a need to transfer people in Mayhem, but these ships still have a speciality. They are usually a bit faster while having the same cost. So it can be an interesting design but the downside is that they cannot carry the XL cargo containers, and that concerns ore, silicon wafers, and all the color crystals and minerals that your mining ships are producing. So not the best choice for your universal freighter that you use throughout your empire. The TM is the military transport. And this ship class is very interesting in Mayhem. It has about the same cost as a M6 Corvette, and it also has the same staying power, like shielding, durability. What it doesn't have is firepower, because it trades that for speed. These TMs are among the fastest ships in the game, and that's incredible for their size. They can also carry the extra large container class, so they can be great looters usually, from their durability, speed, cargo space, and the XL cargo class. And they have the ability to carry and repair fighters. So a very interesting ship design, and I definitely recommend to find some usage for these. And finally, the TL, the large transport. You just need those ships to build your stations. That's basically it. They don't have as much cargo space as you would expect. So for exchanging freight between, if you bulk exchange freight between outposts, for example, then these are not much better than your standard freighters. If you have a standard freighter with 50k of cargo space, then it's almost the same as using one of these. But they are the only ships, the only civilian ship that can carry the station containers. And there's also some special abilities for these, like the mobile factory kit and the crystal transmuter, and also the mobile EMP device.